I'm the HOA. I know how to sit on a plane. Everyone should sit with my plan.
Go to your neighborhood.
Boarding had barely started when Karen made herself known. She stepped onto the jet bridge wearing an HOA-branded polo like it was a uniform, a clipboard tucked under her arm as if she was clocking in. The flight was a standard domestic run, narrow-body aircraft, early afternoon, nothing unusual on the schedule. That changed the second she reached her row and stopped dead, staring at the seat spacing like she'd discovered a zoning violation. She loudly commented that the legroom was non-compliant, and said the airline should disclose measurements up front. A few passengers glanced over, confused but quiet. She wasn't done. Karen pointed at a couple settling into the row behind her and complained about community conduct, saying people were talking too loudly for a shared environment. This was still pre-boarding, bins open, engines silent, the cabin full of movement. Her tone didn't match the moment. A flight attendant doing pre-boarding checks clocked it immediately. The attendant slowed, observed, and made a mental note. That's standard. Crew are trained to spot red flags early, because problems at the gate are easier than problems at altitude. Karen's clipboard and confident scolding stood out like a sore thumb. As more passengers boarded, Karen stayed half-standing in the aisle, narrating her issues. She said overhead bin usage needed to be more orderly, and suggested a time limit for phone calls. Someone chuckled nervously. Another rolled their eyes. The flight attendant approached and asked her to take her seat so boarding could continue. Karen complied, but not before saying she was just trying to help. Minutes later, as the cabin filled, Karen leaned across the aisle and told a passenger their video-audio violated HOA quiet hours. She actually used the phrase quiet hours. The passenger blinked and calmly said this wasn't an HOA. That was the first clear pushback, and it happened fast, just like it should. The flight attendant stepped in immediately, explaining that aircraft behavior is governed by airline policy and FAA regulations. Calm voice, one warning, clear boundary. Karen nodded like she understood, then scribbled something on her clipboard anyway. That little move shifted things again. She wasn't listening. She was documenting. The location changed subtly as the jet bridge door closed and the cabin door remained open. Boarding was nearly complete. Karen started talking again, louder now, saying HOA rules follow residents wherever they travel. She tried to hand a handwritten warning to the passenger about noise. That crossed from annoying into disruptive. The lead flight attendant arrived and explained again that HOA authority has zero jurisdiction on an aircraft. She used the word zero on purpose. Karen dismissed it, saying she had an enforcement responsibility. That line triggered the next escalation. The lead attendant halted boarding and contacted the cockpit. Time compression was clear. Seconds, not minutes. The captain was informed of a non-compliant passenger before pushback. That matters. Once the captain knows, the decision clock starts. Karen refused the instruction to sit quietly and stop engaging others. She stood up, blocking the aisle, arguing about bylaws while passengers watched in dead silence. The captain exited the cockpit, calm and unmistakably in charge. He introduced himself, explained that federal aviation law governs the aircraft, and issued one clear command: sit down, comply, or leave the plane. Karen responded that HOA bylaws outranked airline rules. Saying that to a pilot is like arguing zoning law with a judge mid-sentence. It doesn't end well. The captain didn't debate. He turned to the lead attendant and ordered her removed. Airport security was already en route. Karen protested, saying this was retaliation for enforcing standards. No one reacted. That lack of reaction was the point. Authority doesn't argue. Security arrived within minutes and escorted her off calmly. No cuffs, no drama. Just consequences. The cabin door closed. The flight pushed back on time. At cruising altitude, passengers finally relaxed. Someone muttered, HOA rules don't fly, and the row laughed quietly. The takeaway was obvious and satisfying. HOA authority ends at the jet bridge. Federal law takes over the moment you board. Karen learned that the hard way, clipboard and all. Karen made her first direct move less than 5 minutes after sitting down. A guy across the aisle was scrolling through his phone with the volume low enough that most people wouldn't notice, but Karen noticed. She leaned over, pointed at his screen, and told him his audio violated HOA quiet hours. She said it confidently, like she'd just cited a posted rule. That comment shifted the energy instantly. This wasn't passive complaining anymore. It was direct enforcement. The passenger looked up, clearly surprised but not rattled. He paused his video, took his earbuds out, and calmly said this wasn't an HOA property. No sarcasm. No edge. just a factual statement. That response mattered because it challenged her authority immediately, exactly how these situations are supposed to be handled. He didn't argue tone. He argued jurisdiction. Karen laughed like he'd missed the point and said residents are expected to follow community standards wherever they go. She tapped her clipboard once as if that sealed it. A woman in the next row raised her eyebrows. Someone else shifted in their seat. The cabin felt smaller all of a sudden. The flight attendant who'd been monitoring the aisle during boarding stepped in right away. No delay. No letting it fester. She positioned herself between Karen and the passenger and addressed Karen directly. She explained, calmly and clearly, that aircraft behavior is governed by airline policy and federal aviation regulations, not personal rules or neighborhood agreements. She didn't apologize. She didn't soften it. She stated it. That explanation was the first official authority check, and it came early, exactly as it should. Karen nodded like she understood, then immediately said she was only reminding people of expectations. That sentence tried to reframe enforcement as courtesy. The attendant shut that down by saying all passenger interactions need to stop unless there's a safety issue. One warning. Clean and professional. Karen sat back but she didn't disengage. She wrote something on her clipboard, glancing at the passenger like she was building a case file. That scribbling was subtle but it escalated things. It showed intent to continue, not comply. The passenger noticed and shrugged, choosing not to engage further. That choice prevented the situation from spiraling too fast. The location shifted slightly as boarding wrapped up and the cabin door remained open. The jet bridge noise faded. The plane felt sealed, contained. That matters because behavior issues inside a closed cabin escalate quicker. Karen leaned toward the aisle again and muttered about lack of enforcement consistency. The attendant heard it and made eye contact, a silent warning. Karen then spoke louder, saying it was wild how standards vanished the moment people traveled. That comment drew attention from multiple rows. A few heads turned. Cabin awareness increased. When attention spreads, crew take note, because distractions during boarding are a problem. The flight attendant returned, this time with a firmer tone. She repeated that personal policies don't apply on aircraft and instructed Karen to remain seated and stop addressing other passengers. This was the second boundary, not yet a warning but clearly firmer than before. Karen responded that she had an obligation as an HOA board member to intervene. Saying that out loud was a mistake. The attendant didn't debate credentials. She said plainly that no one has authority on board except the flight crew, and that continued interference would be escalated. That sentence introduced consequences. The escalation ladder was now visible. Karen crossed her arms and said she understood, but standards still mattered. The attendant replied that safety and compliance mattered more and walked away. That withdrawal wasn't surrender. It was documentation in motion. Crew don't hover when they're escalating internally. The passenger Karen confronted put his earbuds back in and looked forward, done with it. The lack of reaction around her isolated Karen socially. That isolation was another subtle shift. When nobody backs you, your leverage disappears. A minute later, the lead flight attendant passed by and exchanged a look with the first attendant. No words. That nonverbal cue mattered. It meant the situation had been flagged. From that point on, Karen was on the radar. Nothing had exploded yet, but the lines were drawn clearly. Karen had been challenged by a passenger, corrected by crew, and warned about authority. Instead of backing off, she kept justifying herself. That choice set up the next escalation. This chapter wasn't about yelling or removal. It was about jurisdiction being challenged early and clearly. Karen didn't accept it. The system noticed. And once the system notices, every move after that carries more weight. The first challenge didn't shut her down. It exposed her. And exposure is always the step right before consequences kick in. Karen didn't take the correction as a stop sign. She treated it like a speed bump. After the flight attendant walked away, she leaned back into the aisle and said, loud enough to carry, that HOA rules follow residents wherever they travel. The wording was deliberate. She wasn't joking. She genuinely believed jurisdiction was portable like a carry-on. That statement alone shifted the mood from annoyance to concern. She flipped her clipboard open again and started writing, pen scratching with purpose. A few passengers glanced over, trying to figure out if this was some kind of prank. It wasn't. Karen tore a sheet from the pad, stood up slightly, and reached across the aisle toward the same passenger she'd already confronted. She said she was issuing a written warning for repeated noise violations. That action crossed a line. Paper in hand, she tried to make it official. The passenger didn't raise his voice. He held up his hand and said he wasn't accepting anything. Come. Firm. That refusal mattered. It denied her the participation she needed to make the moment feel legitimate. Karen scoffed and said refusal would be noted. That comment landed like a bad joke that nobody laughed at. Cabin awareness spiked instantly. Heads turned. Conversation stopped. People in the surrounding rows leaned back slightly, watching. The tension wasn't loud, but it was thick. This wasn't just a Karen moment anymore. This was a disruption during boarding, and everyone knew it. A woman 2 rows up whispered, "Is this for real?" Her seatmate shook his head. Someone across the aisle muttered, "No way." Those quiet reactions added pressure without escalating noise. Karen noticed the attention and seemed to take it as validation instead of a warning sign. She waved the paper once and said community standards don't disappear just because you're on vacation. She actually said vacation like this was a resort, not a regulated aircraft preparing for pushback. The absurdity of it made the tension worse, not better. The flight attendant returned, this time with the lead attendant nearby. That pairing signaled escalation. Crew don't double up unless something's off. The lead attendant asked Karen to hand over the paper and sit down immediately. Karen refused, saying the warning was part of her duties. Saying duties on a plane is a bold move, and not a smart one. The lead attendant explained again that no passenger may issue warnings or documents to other passengers. She used the word may not, which is deliberate. Karen responded that she was being silenced for enforcing rules. That phrasing reframed the situation as persecution, not compliance, and it pushed things forward again. The location subtly changed as boarding paused. The jet bridge door stayed open, but no new passengers boarded. That pause was intentional. Crew were buying time while escalating to the cockpit. Karen didn't seem to notice. She kept talking, saying this kind of behavior would never fly in her community. Someone quietly snorted at the word fly, then stopped themselves. The lead attendant issued a clear instruction. Sit down, put the clipboard away, and stop interacting with other passengers. One warning. Delivered cleanly. Karen sat, but she didn't put the clipboard away. She tucked the paper back into it like she was saving evidence. That half-compliance mattered. It showed resistance without outright refusal. Cabin tension rose another notch. People stopped pretending to scroll. Everyone was watching now. When attention spreads like that, it becomes a safety issue. Crew know that. Karen didn't. She leaned toward the aisle again and said she'd be reporting this to her board. The lead attendant responded that any further disruption would be escalated to the captain. That was the first mention of the cockpit. Once the captain is in play, outcomes get final. Karen laughed and said she'd love to explain this to him. That confidence was misplaced. The lead attendant didn't respond. She turned and walked toward the front. That walk was the real escalation. Silence followed. The cabin felt frozen. The hum of the APU filled the space. Karen looked around, waiting for someone to back her up. No one did. The isolation was complete now. The attempt to issue a written warning didn't assert authority. It exposed how far she was willing to go. By doubling down, she turned a minor correction into a situation requiring command-level involvement. Every 40 seconds, something shifted. Attention spread, instructions hardened, escalation climbed. Karen thought persistence would win. Instead, it narrowed her options. By the time the lead attendant reached the cockpit, the outcome was already tilting against her. Planes don't negotiate authority. They enforce it. And Karen was about to find out exactly how fast that happens when you push past the last polite boundary. The lead flight attendant returned from the front of the cabin with a posture that made the shift obvious. This wasn't casual anymore. She stopped beside Karen's row, squared her stance, and addressed her in a clear, even voice meant to be heard without turning into a spectacle. She explained that all behavior on board the aircraft is governed by FAA regulations and airline policy, not personal standards, not community agreements, and definitely not HOA rules. That statement wasn't opinion. It was law. She went a step further and spelled it out plainly. HOA authority has zero jurisdiction on an aircraft. Zero. The word landed hard because it left no wiggle room. The attendant didn't raise her voice, didn't sound annoyed, didn't lecture. She delivered it like a checklist item, the same way pilots explain seatbelt signs or oxygen masks. Calm, professional, and final. The cabin went quiet in that way that only happens when people sense a line has been crossed. Nearby rows leaned back slightly, pretending not to stare while absolutely paying attention. This was no longer background drama. This was the main event, and everyone knew it. Karen didn't take the explanation as a boundary. She waved it off with a small laugh and said she had an enforcement responsibility as an HOA board member. She actually used the word responsibility like it gave her immunity. That response escalated things instantly because it wasn't confusion anymore. It was rejection of authority. The lead attendant paused for half a beat, then clarified again that no passenger has enforcement powers on board except the flight crew. She explained that interference with other passengers is considered non-compliance and can delay or cancel a flight. That consequence wasn't a threat. It was a fact. Airlines don't mess around with timelines and safety. Karen crossed her arms and said she was being targeted for trying to maintain standards. That framing tried to flip the power dynamic, turning herself into the victim. The attendant didn't bite. She repeated the instruction to stop engaging with other passengers and to put away the clipboard. One warning, clean and clear. The location subtly shifted as the cabin door remained open longer than usual. Boarding had stopped completely. That pause was intentional and visible. When a plane doesn't finish boarding, it means the crew is dealing with something serious. Karen glanced around, finally noticing the delay she'd caused. Instead of backing down, she doubled down again. She said she'd happily explain her enforcement role to anyone higher up. That sentence pushed the situation straight toward escalation. The lead attendant nodded once and said the captain had already been informed. That was the moment the hierarchy snapped into focus. Once the captain is looped in, the outcome stops being flexible. The attendant stepped back slightly, not retreating but creating space. That move wasn't accidental. It signaled the handoff from cabin management to command authority. Karen didn't seem to understand the significance. She muttered about overreach and said FAA rules shouldn't override community standards. Saying that out loud on a plane is like arguing traffic laws with a state trooper mid-stop. It never ends well. Passengers nearby exchanged looks. Someone shook their head slowly. Another whispered, "She really said that." The tension wasn't loud, but it was thick enough to feel. People stopped adjusting bags or checking phones. Everyone was waiting for the next shoe to drop. The lead attendant gave one final instruction. Remain seated, stop addressing others and wait quietly. That was the last chance. No more explanations. No more warnings. Karen nodded but kept the clipboard on her lap, fingers tapping against it like she was itching to keep going. That half-compliance mattered. It showed resistance. A moment later, the captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and controlled, announcing a brief delay. He didn't explain why. He didn't need to. The cabin understood. Karen stiffened at the sound. That announcement marked another escalation, moving the issue from aisle level to aircraft level. The lead attendant walked toward the cockpit without looking back. That walk was decisive. It meant the situation was no longer being handled quietly. It was being handled correctly. Karen looked around for support, but nobody met her eyes. The social isolation was complete. Her claim of enforcement responsibility didn't grant her power. It stripped it away. By dismissing FAA authority, she'd positioned herself against the one system on the plane that actually matters. Planes operate on clear chains of command for a reason. There's no committee debate at 30,000 feet. Every 40 seconds, something changed. Tone hardened, movement paused, authority escalated. Karen thought confidence could override jurisdiction. Instead, it exposed her misunderstanding in front of an entire cabin. By the time the captain stood up from his seat, the outcome was already forming. The rules had been explained. The boundary had been stated. The refusal had been noted. At that point, it wasn't personal. It was procedural. And procedures don't care about clipboards, titles, or HOA slang. Karen had officially run out of room to argue. The aircraft wasn't her neighborhood, and the law on board didn't bend just because she said enforcement responsibility out loud. Karen crossed the line the moment she stood up and planted herself in the aisle. Boarding had already been slowed, but now it stopped completely. She positioned her body just far enough out of her row to block anyone from passing, one hand gripping her clipboard, the other gesturing as she argued. That physical obstruction changed everything. Complaints are one thing. Interfering with movement on an aircraft is another. The lead flight attendant instructed her to sit down immediately so boarding could continue. The wording was direct and deliberate, the kind used when patience is already thin. Karen didn't comply. She stayed standing and said she wasn't finished addressing the issue. That refusal wasn't dramatic, but it was absolute. At that point, it became non-compliance, not misunderstanding. A second flight attendant approached from behind, creating a clear line of authority. They didn't crowd her. They didn't touch her. They simply repeated the instruction, "Return to your seat now." Karen shook her head and said she had a right to stand while enforcing standards. Saying that while blocking an aisle during boarding was a wild move, and several passengers noticed immediately. The cabin environment shifted fast. People stopped lifting bags. Overhead bins remained open. A couple passengers still standing in the aisle froze, unsure whether to move forward or back. That hesitation mattered because safety procedures rely on predictable movement. Karen had introduced uncertainty into a controlled space, and that's where airlines draw the line. The lead attendant warned her that standing in the aisle during boarding was unsafe and that she needed to sit immediately. That was the first and only warning tied to safety. Karen responded by saying she'd sit once the issue was resolved. That conditional compliance was a mistake. Aircraft instructions aren't suggestions and they're not negotiable. As the standoff continued, pre-flight safety procedures were disrupted. Cabin crew couldn't complete checks. A cart sat half-parked near the galley. Another attendant paused mid-briefing. Every second of delay stacked consequences. The engines weren't running yet, but the schedule was already bleeding. Nearby passengers started reacting quietly. Someone whispered, "Just sit down." Another muttered, "This is ridiculous." A guy 2 rows back shook his head and leaned into the aisle to see better. The attention wasn't fueling Karen's authority. It was spotlighting her refusal. The lead attendant escalated again, informing Karen that continued non-compliance would result in removal from the aircraft. That statement was calm and unmistakable. Karen laughed and said they couldn't do that over a clipboard disagreement. That laugh was misplaced confidence and it landed wrong. The location shifted subtly as the jet bridge remained attached and the cabin door stayed open longer than planned. Boarding announcements stopped entirely. That silence was loud. When a plane goes quiet mid-process, something serious is happening. Karen glanced around, realizing for the first time that she'd caused a full stop. Instead of backing down, she doubled down again, saying safety procedures should account for community standards. Saying that during an active safety delay was the final straw. The lead attendant turned away and spoke into her handset, informing the cockpit of a non-compliant passenger blocking the aisle and refusing to sit. That phrasing mattered. Blocking the aisle is a trigger phrase. Within seconds the captain acknowledged. The escalation was now irreversible. Karen was no longer dealing with cabin crew discretion. She was dealing with command authority. The lead attendant turned back and gave one final instruction. "Sit down now." No qualifiers. No explanations. Karen stayed standing. She said she wasn't moving until her concerns were addressed. That sentence sealed it. Refusal to comply with a direct safety instruction is the line airlines do not allow to be crossed. It's not about attitude anymore. It's about control. Passengers around her leaned back, creating space, instinctively distancing themselves. No one wanted to be involved when removal became likely. That social isolation was immediate and complete. Karen stood alone in the aisle, clipboard pressed to her chest like a shield that wasn't working. The captain's footsteps were audible as he exited the cockpit. That sound alone changed the energy in the cabin. Karen turned her head, finally recognizing the gravity of the moment. But by then the decision path was locked in. Blocking the aisle didn't make her point stronger. It ended the conversation. Disrupting pre-flight procedures turned a behavioral issue into a safety issue, and safety issues get resolved decisively. Every 40 to 60 seconds the situation escalated, from standing to refusal to delay to cockpit involvement. Karen thought persistence would force engagement. Instead it triggered protocol. On planes there's no room for standoffs. There's a chain of command and once you step outside it, you don't get to argue your way back in. Karen crossed that line standing in the aisle, and from that moment on, the outcome stopped being about HOA rules and started being about whether she'd be on that flight at all. The escalation moved fast once the flight attendants made the call to stop boarding entirely. The lead attendant raised her hand and told the remaining passengers to hold their positions, then turned toward the galley and picked up the handset. That pause alone was a power shift. Boarding doesn't halt unless something is wrong, and everyone in the cabin felt it instantly. Conversations died. Overhead bins stayed open. The plane froze in place. The lead attendant spoke quietly but clearly into the handset, using language that sounded practiced and precise. She reported a non-compliant passenger refusing crew instructions and blocking the aisle during pre-flight procedures. That phrasing wasn't accidental. Words like non-compliant and safety interference carry weight in aviation. Within seconds the response came back from the cockpit. Acknowledge. That was all anyone heard, but it was enough. Karen noticed the shift but didn't fully grasp it yet. She stayed standing, arms crossed, clipboard pressed against her chest like a badge. She said this was all being blown out of proportion and that she was happy to explain herself to whoever was in charge. The irony was thick. She was about to meet exactly that person. The location dynamic tightened as the jet bridge remained attached and the cabin door stayed open. That limbo space matters. The aircraft wasn't pushing back. It wasn't moving forward. Everything depended on what happened next. The lead attendant returned and issued a final instruction, voice calm and firm. Sit down now and stop engaging. No qualifiers. No debate. Karen shook her head and said she would comply once her concerns were addressed. That conditional response was the mistake. On a plane, instructions aren't conditional. They're binary. You comply or you don't. By refusing again, she escalated the situation from cabin management to command decision. The lead attendant didn't argue. She turned and walked toward the cockpit. That walk was decisive and quiet, and it changed the room. When crew stop talking and start moving with purpose, outcomes are already forming. Passengers shifted in their seats, some craning their necks to see what was happening. The tension wasn't loud, but it was electric. Moments later, the captain stood up from the cockpit doorway. He didn't rush. He didn't look angry. He looked focused. His presence alone reset the hierarchy. This wasn't customer service anymore. This was command authority stepping in to resolve a safety issue before takeoff. The captain approached Karen's row and introduced himself briefly. He explained that he had been informed of a passenger refusing to follow crew instructions and disrupting boarding. His tone was measured and professional. He gave one clear directive: sit down immediately and comply with crew instructions or leave the aircraft. That was it. One instruction. One choice. Karen responded by saying she was enforcing community standards and shouldn't be punished for it. She said this loud enough for nearby rows to hear. That statement sealed her fate. The captain didn't debate HOA logic. He didn't challenge her reasoning. He simply repeated the instruction once more, slower this time, making sure there was no confusion. Karen refused again. She said she wasn't moving until the issue was resolved. That refusal happened in real time, in front of witnesses, after a direct command from the captain. At that point, the decision was automatic. The captain nodded once and turned back toward the cockpit. He told the lead attendant to have airport security meet the aircraft. That sentence ended the argument. There was no more discussion, no more explaining, no more chances. The escalation was complete. The lead attendant notified the gate agent, and the process moved fast. Passengers watched as procedures kicked in smoothly, almost boringly, which made it more serious. No chaos. No yelling. Just protocol unfolding step by step. Karen finally looked around, realizing the cabin wasn't backing her up. People avoided eye contact. Someone shook their head. Another whispered, "She really did this to herself." The social isolation hit hard, but it was too late. The captain made an announcement explaining there would be a brief delay to address a passenger compliance issue. He didn't name her. He didn't need to. Everyone knew. The tone was calm, almost reassuring, which underscored how routine this was for him. Karen stayed standing until security arrived at the door. That final refusal didn't help her case. It only confirmed everything the crew had reported. When authority gives you a last instruction and you ignore it, there's no recovery. In aviation, escalation doesn't come with drama. It comes with clarity. Boarding stops. The cockpit is notified. The captain decides. Karen refused the final instruction, and the system responded exactly the way it's designed to. She thought persistence would force negotiation. Instead, it triggered removal. On a plane, there's no HOA meeting, no vote, no appeal. There's a chain of command, and once you challenge it, the outcome is fast, firm, and final. The captain stepped fully into the aisle, and the cabin felt different instantly. This wasn't customer service anymore. This was command authority taking the floor. He stood squarely, hands relaxed, voice steady, and introduced himself just enough to make the hierarchy unmistakable. He didn't look angry or rushed. He looked like someone who had already decided what came next if compliance didn't happen. He addressed Karen directly, using her seat number to remove any ambiguity. He stated that he had been informed of repeated interference with boarding and refusal to follow crew instructions. Then he issued one clear command: sit down immediately, secure your belongings, and stop engaging with other passengers. No qualifiers. No side commentary. One instruction, clean and simple. The cabin went dead quiet. Even the hum from the galley seemed louder. Nearby rows leaned back, eyes forward, pretending not to watch while absolutely watching. This was the moment where everything could still de-escalate if Karen chose to comply. The clock was ticking in seconds, not minutes. Karen didn't sit. She straightened up instead and said HOA bylaws outrank airline rules. She said it with confidence like it was a trump card. The words landed wrong in that space. A couple passengers exchanged looks like, did she really just say that to a pilot? The audacity was wild. The captain didn't debate her claim. He didn't argue jurisdiction point by point. He didn't raise his voice. He repeated the instruction once, slower, making sure it was unmistakable. Sit down now or you will be removed from the aircraft. That repetition wasn't negotiation. It was documentation happening out loud. Karen shook her head and said she wasn't moving until her concerns were addressed. She framed it as standing up for standards, not refusing a command. That framing didn't matter. On an aircraft, intent doesn't override compliance. The captain nodded once, acknowledging her answer, and turned slightly toward the lead attendant. That nod was the real escalation. It was the signal that the decision had been made. The captain instructed the lead attendant to coordinate with the gate for security assistance. He didn't announce it to the cabin. He said it quietly, professionally. Authority doesn't need a microphone. The location shifted again as the jet bridge agent appeared at the doorway, alerted by the call. The plane remained docked, engines off, but the situation had moved from internal management to external enforcement. Karen noticed the change and finally looked uncertain. The confidence drained a notch. She tried again, saying airline policies shouldn't override community standards. The captain responded that federal aviation regulations govern the aircraft and that refusing crew instructions is a safety issue. He added that safety issues are not debated on board. That sentence shut the door on argument. It reframed everything. Passengers started whispering now, low and quick. Someone muttered, "This is nuts." Another said, "She's about to get bounced." The slang carried nervous humor, but nobody laughed out loud. People know when a line has been crossed. The captain stepped back, giving space. That wasn't retreat. It was procedure. He allowed the system to do what it does. The lead attendant moved into position, standing beside Karen's row, while another attendant cleared the aisle ahead. Small movements, coordinated, calm. Karen finally said she'd sit if the captain acknowledged her authority. That conditional offer didn't land. The captain replied that there would be no acknowledgement and that the instruction still stood. He didn't repeat it again. He didn't need to. The window for compliance had closed. Security arrived at the aircraft door within minutes, exactly as protocol dictates. 2 officers stood by, not aggressive, just present. The captain informed Karen she would be removed due to noncompliance. He used the word removed, not escorted, to be precise. Karen protested, saying this was retaliation. The captain didn't respond. He turned back toward the cockpit, his role complete. The authority intervention had done its job. The outcome was now mechanical. As Karen gathered her things under supervision, the cabin exhaled. The tension broke like a snapped rubber band. People avoided eye contact, not out of sympathy but relief. Nobody wanted to be part of what just happened. The captain made a brief announcement explaining a short delay due to a compliance issue and thanked everyone for their patience. His tone was calm, almost reassuring. That calmness underscored how routine this was for him. Karen stepped off the plane without ceremony, clipboard still in hand, authority gone. The jet bridge door closed behind her. The hierarchy reasserted itself cleanly and without drama. The lesson was obvious to everyone on board. HOA bylaws don't outrank airline rules. They don't even show up on the same map. On a plane there's one chain of command and when you challenge it the response isn't loud. It's final. The resolution came fast once the captain made the call. He didn't argue, didn't lecture, and didn't look back. He gave a short instruction to the lead flight attendant, who immediately nodded and stepped into motion. That nod was the final switch flip. From that second on, Karen wasn't a problem being discussed. She was a passenger being removed. Airport security arrived at the aircraft door almost immediately, calm and composed, exactly how you want it. 2 officers stepped inside, introduced themselves briefly, and asked Karen to gather her belongings. No raised voices. No grabbing. Just procedure. That alone shifted the power one last time. This wasn't about opinions or standards anymore. It was about compliance with federal aviation rules. Karen tried one last angle, saying this was excessive and that she'd already explained herself. One officer responded evenly that the captain's decision was final and that refusal to leave would escalate things further. That sentence carried weight without sounding threatening. It laid out the fork in the road clearly. Karen chose the only option left. She grabbed her bag and clipboard, movements sharp and frustrated, muttering about unfair treatment. Nobody responded. The silence from the cabin was louder than any argument. Passengers stared straight ahead, suddenly very interested in seat backs and window shades. That social wall mattered. It told her there was no audience left. As she stepped into the aisle, the officers positioned themselves just close enough to guide without touching. They walked at an unhurried pace toward the front, making sure the path stayed clear. The location shifted from cabin to jet bridge, and with it, Karen's authority vanished completely. The plane wasn't her stage anymore. Once she crossed the threshold, the lead flight attendant closed the aircraft door behind her. That sound was soft but decisive. It marked the end of the conflict. Inside, the crew moved immediately into reset mode. Overhead bins were checked. Passengers adjusted bags. The cabin returned to routine like nothing had happened. The captain made a brief announcement, thanking everyone for their patience and confirming they were ready to depart. His voice was steady, unbothered, like this was just another item checked off a list. And honestly, for him it was. Flights deal with non-compliance all the time. The difference here was how cleanly it ended. The jet bridge pulled back. The doors sealed. The plane pushed off the gate right on schedule. No delay. No drama. That detail mattered. Karen hadn't disrupted the flight. She'd removed herself from it. The system worked exactly as designed. As the aircraft taxied, a low wave of relief moved through the cabin. Someone whispered, "Well, that was something." Another passenger quietly said, "HOA rules don't fly," and a few people chuckled under their breath. The humor wasn't cruel. It was release. Tension had finally snapped. The flight attendants resumed their duties like pros, moving down the aisle, checking seatbelts, offering water. No one mentioned Karen again. They didn't need to. The situation was over, and professionalism meant not dragging it out. At cruising altitude, conversations returned to normal. People pulled out laptops, headphones, snacks. The incident already felt like a weird pre-flight memory, the kind you tell later and shake your head at. But the lesson stuck. Everyone on board had seen what happens when someone confuses confidence with jurisdiction. Karen, meanwhile, was left standing at the gate with a clipboard full of rules that meant nothing there. She'd been escorted off calmly, not because anyone was mad, but because she refused to understand the hierarchy. On a plane, there's one chain of command. Break it and you're done. The aftermath wasn't loud or viral. It was clean. Captain orders removal. Security escorts. Doors close. Wheels up. That's why it felt satisfying. No theatrics. Just consequences that matched the behavior. The flight continued without another hiccup. Passengers arrived at their destination on time, barely thinking about it anymore. Karen missed her trip, learned a very public lesson, and lost the only power she thought she had. In the end, the resolution proved one thing clearly: HOA authority ends long before the runway. Federal rules don't bend, captains don't negotiate, and planes don't wait for someone to finish an argument in the aisle. The consequences kept rolling long after the plane pushed back from the gate. Karen didn't get marched to a holding room or thrown into some dramatic standoff, but what happened next hit her where it hurt: logistics, money, and reputation. At the service desk just outside the gate, an airline supervisor explained her options in a flat, no-nonsense tone. Because she'd been removed for non-compliance, rebooking wasn't guaranteed. If seats were available later, she could pay the fare difference plus change fees. If not, she'd be denied same-day travel entirely. No arguing. No exceptions. Karen tried to negotiate, saying she hadn't done anything dangerous. The supervisor didn't bite. She explained that refusing crew instructions is classified as a compliance issue, not a customer service hiccup. That classification mattered. It meant Karen wasn't just inconvenienced. She was flagged. The power dynamic had shifted again, this time from the aircraft to the airline's operational system, where decisions are logged and shared. While Karen stood at the counter, the incident report was already being filed. The lead flight attendant completed it digitally, documenting the refusal to sit, the aisle blockage, and the captain's direct instruction. Those reports aren't emotional. They're factual, time-stamped, and reviewed. Once filed, they become part of an internal record that can affect future bookings. Karen's name was now tied to a non-compliance note. That sticks. The supervisor told her plainly that the report would remain on file and that future travel could be subject to additional scrutiny or denial. Karen scoffed, saying that was overkill. The supervisor replied that airline safety policy doesn't scale down just because someone disagrees with it. That sentence ended the conversation. Karen eventually walked away from the desk, phone pressed to her ear, trying to reroute her plans. She wasn't yelling anymore. She was stressed. Missed connections mean missed meetings, hotel penalties, and awkward explanations. The cost wasn't just the ticket. It was the ripple effect. Meanwhile, at 35,000 feet, the cabin had fully relaxed. Seatbelt signs went off. Laptops opened. Drinks were poured. The incident turned into low-key conversation fuel. A guy across the aisle said, "Did she really think HOA rules work on a plane?" Someone else laughed quietly and said, "That's next-level confidence." The irony was too clean not to mention. A flight attendant walked by and smiled when someone joked that HOA bylaws don't survive TSA. She didn't comment, but the grin said enough. Humor landed because the situation had resolved properly. No chaos, no delay, just a firm outcome. A few rows back, a couple compared notes about weird travel stories. This one ranked high. Someone said they'd never seen a captain shut something down so fast. Another replied that it's because planes don't play games with authority. That observation stuck. Everyone on board had just watched the system work exactly as designed. As the flight continued, the story already started morphing into a "you won't believe this" anecdote. People typed messages to friends, careful not to exaggerate. The facts were wild enough. HOA clipboard. Aisle standoff. Captain intervention. Removal before takeoff. That's a clean arc. Back on the ground, Karen's options narrowed. Later flights were full. Same-day travel wasn't happening. She'd have to try again tomorrow, assuming the system allowed it. That denial wasn't dramatic, but it was effective. Consequences don't need volume to sting. By the time the plane landed, most passengers had moved on, but the takeaway lingered. Authority on an aircraft is absolute, and challenging it is a fast way off the flight. The irony wasn't just that Karen tried to enforce HOA rules in the air. It was that she ignored the one set of rules that actually mattered. The airline's incident report closed the loop. It documented the behavior, the warnings, and the outcome. That report didn't shame her. It simply recorded reality. In aviation, that's enough. Once airborne, people laughed, shook their heads, and went back to their lives. Karen, meanwhile, was stuck rebooking, paying fees, and explaining why she missed her trip. No one needed to yell at her. The system handled it. The consequences beyond the flight were quiet but thorough. Denied travel, added costs, a permanent note, and a cabin full of strangers who witnessed exactly how misplaced authority gets grounded. Karen's trip ended before it ever really began, and the fallout followed her all the way home. Missing that flight wasn't just an inconvenience. It unraveled her entire plan. Hotels had to be rebooked, meetings rescheduled, excuses invented. When she finally managed to secure a later ticket days out, the airline flagged her reservation for additional screening. Nothing dramatic, just extra steps, longer waits, and the quiet understanding that her name now lived in the system for the wrong reasons. That alone changed how she traveled going forward. A week later, an official email arrived from the airline. It wasn't emotional or accusatory. It simply stated that due to a documented non-compliance incident, future travel could be denied at the captain's discretion. That line hit hard. She wasn't banned outright, but she wasn't guaranteed passage either. Every trip would now carry a question mark. For someone used to asserting control, that uncertainty was brutal. Back in the neighborhood, word traveled faster than she expected. Someone from the flight had recognized her HOA polo and connected the dots. Screenshots of texts and secondhand retellings made their way into local group chats. Nobody embellished it. They didn't need to. The facts were embarrassing enough on their own. The HOA board scheduled a meeting shortly after. This time, Karen wasn't leading it. She sat at the end of the table, arms folded, jaw tight. Management was present again, which was never a good sign. The board chair explained that they'd received multiple complaints about her behavior, including concerns about reputational damage. That phrase came up again, calm and clinical. They didn't accuse her of wrongdoing within the HOA. They didn't argue airline policy. They focused on one thing: public embarrassment tied directly to her role as a board member. She'd represented herself as an authority figure in a public, regulated space where she had none. That reflection landed on the entire association, and the board wasn't willing to eat that risk. Karen tried to defend herself, saying she'd been misunderstood and that standards matter everywhere. The board listened, then moved on. One member pointed out that authority without jurisdiction isn't leadership, it's liability. Another added that bringing HOA branding into unrelated conflicts exposes the community to ridicule. No raised voices. No drama. Just consequences. The reprimand was formal and documented. She was removed from any enforcement-related duties immediately. No issuing notices. No compliance checks. No speaking on behalf of the board. Her role was reduced to administrative tasks only, pending further review. That demotion was quiet but total. After the meeting, neighbors didn't confront her. They didn't need to. The shift was obvious. Conversations stopped when she approached. People nodded politely and moved on. The social power she once wielded evaporated. That kind of loss stings more than fines or warnings. Over time, the story became shorthand in the community. "Remember the plane thing?" people would say, shaking their heads. It wasn't mean-spirited. It was instructive. Everyone understood the lesson now. Karen avoided public HOA events after that. She stopped wearing the branded polo. The clipboard disappeared. When she traveled again, she kept her head down, followed instructions, and didn't say a word. Experience has a way of humbling people fast. The final takeaway settled in clearly for everyone watching, both on that flight and back home. HOA authority ends at the jet bridge, not the runway. It doesn't board with you. It doesn't override federal rules. It doesn't survive a captain's command. Karen learned that the hard way. No shouting. No spectacle. Just a closed aircraft door, a missed trip, a formal reprimand, and a reputation that never fully bounced back. Confidence without jurisdiction doesn't travel well, and on a plane there's no room for imaginary power. In the end, the system worked exactly as designed. The right authority stepped in, the wrong one stepped out, and life moved on. Karen thought rules followed her everywhere. Turns out they don't even make it past the gate.
Alright, now I want to hear from you. Do you think she was completely out of the line here? Or do you believe authority sometimes goes too far? Drop your take in comments, I read every single one.